The brass buckle on his father's gun belt slipped one notch too small, a hollow truth in the pre-dawn quiet. Elias Vance's fingers paused over the worn leather, the kind of pause that happens when a man realizes something he'd rather not think about. He'd lost weight again. The cattle prices had dropped in Cheyenne, and he'd been surviving on coffee and hard biscuits for weeks. October 1887 was shaping up to be the kind of autumn that broke men's spirits. The cabin around him creaked with the morning cold. Through the single-glass window, the Wyoming sky was just beginning to lighten, that soft gray that comes before the sun touches the mountains. Elias could see his breath as he finished fastening the belt. 40 years old, living alone on 200 acres of high country grass, and the only sound in his home was the wind and his own boots on the wooden floor. He walked to the window and looked out at his land. The cattle were dark shapes in the distance, huddled together against the chill. 12 miles to the nearest neighbor. 20 to the town of Medicine Bow. It was exactly the life he'd wanted after the war, after everything he'd seen. A life where the only person who could disappoint him was the man in the mirror. But that mirror had shown him something new lately. Something restless. On the mantelpiece, propped against a tin of matches, sat a letter. The paper had softened from him reading it so many times. It was from a matrimonial agency in Boston, confirming that a woman named Clara Jenkins would be arriving on the afternoon stage. October 15th. Today. Elias had written to the agency back in August, after a night of particularly bad loneliness. He'd sat at this same table, by the light of a kerosene lamp, and tried to describe himself in a way that didn't sound pathetic. Hard worker. Own land. No bad habits. Looking for a wife to share this life. He'd sealed the envelope before he could change his mind, and then spent 2 months convincing himself she'd never actually come. But she was coming. Today. He built a fire in the cast-iron stove and put the coffee pot on. While it heated, he checked the locks on the door. Then he checked them again. Old habits from the war. From the years after, too, when a lone rancher had to be his own sheriff. The door was solid. The rifle was where it belonged, above the door. The shutters could be barred from inside. He was a man who prepared for trouble. That was his job. His protection. The coffee was bitter and hot, and he drank it standing by the window, watching the sun finally crest the mountains. The light turned the frost on the grass into a million tiny diamonds. Beautiful, in that harsh way this country had. Beautiful, but unforgiving. He thought about what she might expect. A woman from Boston, used to pave streets and neighbors close enough to hear you call. What would she make of this? The miles of empty land, the wind that never stopped, the silence that could press against your ears like water. What would she make of him? Elias set the coffee cup down and walked to the small mirror hanging by the door. He barely recognized the man looking back. Sun-weathered skin, deep lines around the eyes from squinting into too many sunsets. Hair that needed cutting. A face that had forgotten how to smile easily. Lord help her, he muttered to himself. Lord help us both. The morning passed like most mornings. He fed the chickens, checked on the cow that was close to calving, and split wood until his shoulders burned. Work was the medicine for thinking too much. Always had been. But today, his mind kept wandering back to the cabin, to the letter, to the hours ticking down. At noon, he went inside and washed up. He put on his cleanest shirt, the blue one his mother had made him before she passed. It was faded now, but it was the best he had. He ran a comb through his hair, then gave up and put his hat on. The wagon ride to town took an hour. The road was rutted from the fall rains, and the wagon bounced and creaked with every turn of the wheels. Elias kept his eyes on the horizon, scanning like he always did. 3 days ago, he'd seen riders along his southern fence line. Men he didn't recognize, on horses he didn't know. They'd watched him for a long moment, then ridden on. But he hadn't forgotten the way they looked at his land. At his cattle. A man with something worth taking had to stay alert. Medicine Bow wasn't much of a town. A main street with a general store, a livery stable, a saloon, and the stage depot. Maybe 100 people total. But today, the depot was busier than usual. A few folks had gathered, curious about who might be getting off the stage. New faces were rare out here. Elias parked the wagon and walked over, his boots raising small puffs of dust. He stood apart from the small crowd, arms crossed, waiting. The afternoon sun was warm on his shoulders. He could hear the murmur of conversation, a dog barking somewhere, the creak of a sign swinging in the breeze. Then he heard it. The distant rumble of wheels, the jangle of harnesses. The stagecoach came over the rise, kicking up a cloud of dust that hung in the air like smoke. It grew larger as it approached, the horses blowing hard, the driver cracking his whip more for show than need. The stage pulled up to the depot in a flurry of motion. Dust swirled around everyone. Horses stamped and snorted. The driver jumped down and opened the door. Elias scanned the faces, looking for someone who looked as nervous as he felt. He expected a woman in a fancy dress, maybe carrying a parasol, looking around with wide eyes at this rough frontier town. Instead, a woman stumbled out like she was falling. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, the fabric hanging loose. There was a dark bruise blooming on her cheekbone, purple and yellow at the edges, not more than a day old. Her eyes, fierce, terrified, searching, found him for just a second before someone else moved. Two rough men pushed through the small crowd. One of them, a man with a chipped front tooth and mean little eyes, grabbed the woman's arm. His grip was hard enough to make her wince. "There you are, Clara," the man said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "We've been looking everywhere for you. Our business ain't finished." The woman, Clara, or whoever she was, didn't say a word. She just made a sound. A sharp intake of breath, small and wounded, like an animal caught in a trap. It wasn't loud. Probably nobody else heard it over the noise of the stage and the crowd. But Elias heard it. It hit him right in the chest, that sound. It went through all the walls he'd built, all the years of keeping himself separate, and landed somewhere deep that he'd forgotten existed. His feet moved before his mind caught up. He stepped forward, threading through the people, until he was standing right there, right between this woman and the man with the chipped tooth. The man looked him up and down. Sized him up. "This ain't your concern, friend." Elias didn't look at him. He looked at the woman, at the bruise on her face, at the way she was holding herself so still, like she was trying to disappear, at the tears she was fighting to hold back. "You're bleeding," Elias said. His voice came out rough, a dry rasp that hadn't been used for talking much. He pointed to a small cut on her arm, just below the torn sleeve, probably from the stage door or from fighting whoever had given her that bruise. The woman blinked at him. Something shifted in her eyes. Not trust, not yet. But something. A tiny flicker, like a match striking in the dark. The man with the chipped tooth tightened his grip on her arm. "I told you, this ain't." Elias turned to look at him then. Just looked. 40 years of hard living, of war, of surviving winters that killed lesser men, of protecting what was his. He put all of it into that look. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just looked. The man's mouth opened, then closed. His partner, standing behind him, shifted uneasily. For a long moment, nobody moved. The crowd had gone quiet. Even the horses seemed to sense something had changed. Then the man let go of the woman's arm. He stepped back, a sneer trying to reclaim his face. "This ain't over," he said. But his voice had lost its confidence. He pointed at Elias. "You hear me. This ain't over, Vance." He knew his name. Elias filed that away. The man turned and walked away, his partner following. They disappeared into the saloon across the street, but Elias could feel them watching through the window. The woman was still standing there, swaying slightly. Elias reached out, slowly, giving her time to flinch or pull away. She didn't. He took her elbow, gentle, and guided her toward his wagon. "Come on," he said. That was all. She climbed up onto the wagon seat without a word. He walked around and climbed up beside her, picked up the reins, clicked to the horses. The wagon pulled away from the depot, leaving the crowd and the dust and the questions behind. The road back to his cabin stretched out ahead, empty and long. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the mountains. Neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon and the steady clop of hooves on packed dirt. Beside him, the woman hugged herself against the cooling air, her torn dress offering little warmth. Elias reached behind the seat and pulled out his old work coat, the one he kept for cold mornings. He handed it to her without looking. She took it. After a moment, he heard her pull it on. It was too big, swallowing her small frame. But she stopped shivering. They rode on toward the cabin, toward whatever came next. And Elias realized, with a clarity that surprised him, that nothing about this day had gone the way he'd planned. Nothing about his life was going to be the same. The stagecoach depot had felt like the end of one journey. But as the mountains grew closer and the cabin waited ahead, Elias understood that the real journey was just beginning. Sometimes the things we think we want turn out to be doorways to things we never knew we needed. And sometimes, the greatest protection one person can offer another is simply showing up, in the right moment, and refusing to look away. The wagon creaked and groaned over the rutted road, each bump sending a small jolt through the wooden seat. Elias kept his eyes straight ahead, fixed on the distant mountains, but every other sense was tuned to the woman beside him. The woman who was supposed to be Clara Jenkins, mail-order bride from Boston. The woman with a fresh bruise on her face and terror in her eyes. She hadn't spoken since they left Medicine Bow. She sat huddled in his old work coat, her hands buried in the too long sleeves, her body angled away from him like she might jump off and run at any moment. The torn shoulder of her dress peeked out from under the coat, and Elias could see the skin beneath was raw, red, like someone had grabbed her hard enough to leave marks. The afternoon sun was warm on his face, but there was a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the weather. October 15th, 1887. The day his life had split into before and after. His hands gripped the reins tighter than necessary. The leather bit into his palms. He could still feel it, that moment at the depot when his feet moved before his brain caught up. Could still hear that small, wounded sound she'd made. Could still see the mean little eyes of the man with the chipped tooth, the way he'd said Elias's name like he knew him, like this was all part of some plan Elias didn't understand yet. The horses knew the way home. They plodded along without much guidance, saving Elias from having to think about direction. That was good, because thinking about anything else was hard enough. Beside him, the woman shifted. The coat rustled. He risked a glance away and found her staring at him. Not with gratitude or relief. With something closer to assessment, like she was trying to figure out if she jumped from one fire into another. "You're bleeding," he'd said at the depot. Those two words felt like a lifetime ago now. The road curved, following the line of a shallow creek. Cottonwood trees lined the banks, their leaves turned golden brown, some already fallen into the slow-moving water. Elias had ridden this road thousands of times. He knew every bend, every rock, every place where the road turned to mud after rain. But today it felt foreign, like he was seeing it through someone else's eyes. "You know those men." Her voice was rough, scratchy, like she hadn't used it in days. Or like she'd been screaming. Elias turned to look at her fully. She was watching him with those fierce, assessing eyes. The bruise on her cheekbone had darkened during the ride, purple spreading into green at the edges. "No," he said. "Never seen them before." She nodded slowly, like she was filing that information away. Then she turned back to face the road, and the silence returned. But it was a different silence now. Less empty. More like a held breath. The miles passed. The sun dropped lower, painting the mountains in shades of orange and pink. The temperature dropped with it. Elias could feel the cold seeping through his shirt, and he regretted giving away his coat. Not enough to ask for it back, but enough to notice. The cabin came into view around the last bend. Small and square and solid, nestled against a grove of pines. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, thin and grey against the darkening sky. He'd left the fire banked before leaving, and it had kept burning, waiting for his return. "Home," Elias said. The word felt strange on his tongue. It had been a long time since he'd said it to anyone. The woman didn't respond, but her eyes were fixed on the cabin, taking in every detail. The chipped blue door, the stack of firewood along the north wall, the small corral with his 2 horses, the vegetable garden, gone to seed now after the first frost. 100 details that Elias never thought about anymore, seen fresh through her gaze. He pulled the wagon up to the cabin and set the brake. The horses stamped and blew, glad to be home. Elias climbed down, his boots landing soft on the packed earth. He walked around to her side and offered his hand. She looked at his hand for a long moment. Then she took it. Her fingers were cold, even through his work-worn gloves. She climbed down carefully, her torn dress catching on the edge of the wagon seat. When her feet touched the ground, she didn't let go of his hand right away. Just stood there, holding on, like he was the only solid thing in a world that kept shifting under her. Then she let go and wrapped her arms around herself again. Elias led the way to the cabin. His hand paused on the latch, the same habit he had every time, checking that everything was as he'd left it. The door opened with its familiar creak, and warm air rushed out, carrying the smell of wood smoke and coffee and the stew he'd left simmering on the back of the stove. He stepped aside to let her enter first. She paused on the threshold. Her eyes moved around the single room, taking in the bed in the corner, the table with its 2 chairs, the rifle above the door, the fire crackling in the stone hearth, the letter still propped on the mantelpiece. Taking in his whole life, laid out in one small space. Then she stepped inside. Elias closed the door behind them. The latch fell into place with a solid click. He built up the fire while she stood in the middle of the room, still holding herself, still not speaking. The flames caught and grew, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Sit down," Elias said. He pulled out one of the chairs from the table. "You need to eat." She Saturday. He ladled stew into a bowl and set it in front of her with a spoon. Then he poured coffee into a tin cup and placed that beside the bowl. He didn't sit. He stood by the fire, watching her, giving her space. She stared at the food like she'd forgotten what it was. Then, slowly, she picked up the spoon. Her hand trembled as she brought it to her mouth. She ate like someone who hadn't seen a proper meal in days. Maybe longer. Elias waited until she'd finished half the bowl before he spoke again. "What's your name?" She looked up at him. For a moment, he saw her consider lying. Saw her weigh the options behind those tired, frightened eyes. Then something shifted in her face. A decision made. "Margaret," she said. "Margaret Walsh." "Not Clara." "Of course not." Elias nodded slowly. The letter said Clara Jenkins. The letter was a lie. She set the spoon down. Her voice was steadier now, like eating had given her back some strength. "I needed to get west fast. A friend in Boston knew someone at the agency. She made it happen." "Why did you need to get west fast?" Margaret's hand moved, almost without her noticing, to cover her wrist. The one with the scar hidden beneath her sleeve. Elias caught the movement, filed it away. "Those men at the depot," she said instead. "They've been following me since Omaha. I thought I'd lost them in Cheyenne. I was wrong." "They know my name," Elias said. "They knew where to find you." Margaret closed her eyes. When she opened them, there was something new there. Guilt, maybe, or fear of what came next. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to bring this to your door. I didn't mean to bring any of this to anyone." Her voice cracked on the last word. Elias looked at the fire, at the flames consuming the wood, turning it to heat and ash. He thought about his quiet life, his empty cabin, his solitary mornings and silent evenings. All of it changed now, because he'd heard a sound he couldn't ignore. "Finish your stew," he said. "We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." Margaret picked up the spoon again, but before she took another bite, she reached for the coffee. As she stretched her arm across the table, her sleeve pulled back, just for a moment. Elias saw it clearly in the firelight. Not just bruises. An old scar, white and thick, circling her wrist like a bracelet. The kind of scar made by metal, by manacles, by being bound against your will. Margaret saw him see it. She froze, her arms still extended, the scar exposed. Her eyes met his across the small space of the cabin, and in them he saw fear, yes, but also something else. A challenge. A question. Now you know. What are you going to do about it? The fire crackled. The wind picked up outside, rattling the window. Elias stood very still, his back to the warmth, his eyes on the woman who wasn't who she said she was. And in that moment, he understood. The letter on his mantelpiece, the one he'd read so many times, the one that had given him hope for a new beginning, it was all built on a lie. She wasn't a lonely seamstress seeking a husband and a new life. She was someone else entirely. Someone with a past written in scars on her skin. Someone running from something so terrible that she'd crossed half a continent to escape it. Someone who had brought that past right to his door. The realization settled over him like the cold night air. Heavy. Unavoidable. He'd wanted a wife, a partner, someone to share this hard life. Instead, he'd gotten a woman with secrets, a woman with enemies, a woman whose very presence in his cabin might put them both in danger. And yet when he looked at her, sitting at his table, wrapped in his coat, with firelight softening the fear on her face, he didn't feel anger. He didn't feel betrayed. He felt something else entirely. Something he couldn't name. Something that had started the moment he heard that small, wounded sound at the depot. He pulled out the other chair and sat down across from her. "Tomorrow," he said again. "We'll figure it out tomorrow." Margaret lowered her arm, hiding the scar once more. She nodded, a small movement, barely there. Then she picked up her coffee and drank, her eyes never leaving his. Outside, the wind howled around the cabin. Inside, the fire burned on. Two strangers sat at a small wooden table in the Wyoming wilderness, bound together now by circumstance and choice and a lie that had brought them both to this moment. Sometimes the things we think we want turn out to be completely different from what we actually need. And sometimes, the lies people tell aren't meant to deceive us, but to protect themselves from a world that has already hurt them too much. Elias didn't know Margaret's story yet, but sitting across from her in the firelight, watching the fear slowly ease from her face, he realized he wanted to learn it. Every single part. 3 days had passed since Margaret Walsh walked into Elias Vance's cabin. 3 days of cold autumn rain lashing against the windows, of wind rattling the shutters, of silence growing heavier with each passing hour. October 18th, 1887. Elias marked the date on the small calendar by the door, though he wasn't sure why. Some habits just wouldn't let go. Margaret hadn't spoken about the scar on her wrist. Not once. She helped around the cabin, silent and efficient, washing dishes, sweeping the floor, mending her torn dress with needle and thread she'd found in a drawer. She moved like someone used to making herself small, used to not being noticed. But Elias noticed everything. The way she flinched at sudden sounds. The way she positioned herself with her back to the wall. The way her eyes followed him when she thought he wasn't looking. The rain had turned the yard to mud. Elias couldn't do his usual work, couldn't check on the cattle or mend fences or chop wood. He was trapped inside his own cabin with a stranger, and the walls felt like they were closing in. On the third morning, he found himself checking the rifle again. Then the ammunition. Then the locks on the door. The same routine, over and over, like his hands couldn't stop looking for something to do. Margaret watched him from the table, a cup of coffee cupped in her hands, saying nothing. The fire crackled and popped. The rain drummed steady on the roof. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked away the seconds, each one louder than the last. Elias caught his reflection in the dark window glass. Rain streaked down the outside, distorting his image, making him look like someone else. A stranger. A man he didn't recognize. What he saw stopped him cold. He saw a man who called himself a protector, but who had done nothing but hide. He saw a man who had brought a wounded woman to his cabin and then locked the door, waiting for trouble to find them instead of facing it. He saw a jailer, not a guardian. A coward dressed up in a cattleman's clothes. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He gripped the window frame, his knuckles white, his breath fogging the glass. All these years, he'd told himself he was building a safe place. A fortress against the world. But a fortress was just a prison with better walls. And now he'd put someone else inside it with him. You should have let them take me. Her voice came from behind him, soft and tired. Elias turned from the window. Margaret hadn't moved from the table. She sat with her coffee, staring into the dark liquid like it held answers. "What?" he said. "You heard me." She looked up, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he saw something other than fear in her eyes. Resignation. Defeat. The look of someone who had stopped hoping. Those men at the depot. You should have let them take me. Would have saved you all this trouble. Elias walked to the table and sat down across from her. The wood was rough under his forearms. He could smell the coffee, the wood smoke, the rain. Could smell her, too, a faint scent of lavender soap from the small bar she'd found by the wash basin. "That's not how it works," he said. "How does it work, Elias?" She set the cup down. Her hands were shaking, just a little. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've done. What I've run from. Those men aren't going to give up. They'll come here, and when they do, you'll wish you'd never gone to that depot. Then tell me." The words hung between them. The fire popped. The rain kept falling. Margaret stared at him for a long moment. Then she took a deep breath, and the story came out like water through a broken dam. Her name really was Margaret Walsh. She'd grown up in a small town outside Boston, the daughter of a shoemaker. When her father died, she'd gone to work as a maid in a big house owned by a man named Cornelius Hayes. A man with connections, with power, with a secret. She'd been cleaning his study late one night when she heard sounds from the parlor. Raised voices. A struggle. She'd peeked through the crack in the door and seen Hayes arguing with a man she didn't recognize. Seen Hayes pick up a heavy candlestick and bring it down. Seen the man fall and not get up. "I ran," Margaret said. Her voice was flat, like she was reading a newspaper account of someone else's life. "I should have gone to the police. I know that now. But I was 19 years old and terrified, and I ran. By morning, I was on a train heading west." Hayes had people looking for her. People who couldn't afford to have a witness show up someday and tell what she'd seen. She'd changed her name, changed her appearance, moved from city to city. But they always found her. Always got close. The last time, in Chicago, they'd caught her. Held her for 3 days in a basement. That's where the scar on her wrist came from. The manacles. "I got away," she said. "Barely. A friend helped me disappear again, set me up with a mail-order story, put me on a stage to Wyoming. I thought if I went far enough, if I buried myself in the middle of nowhere, they'd stop looking." She laughed, a hollow sound with no humor in it. "But they never stopped looking. They found me in Omaha. Followed me to Cheyenne. And now they're out there somewhere, waiting." Elias sat perfectly still. The rain filled the silence. "How many?" he asked. "3 that I've seen. There might be more." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup again, holding on like it was the only warm thing in the world. "The one with the chipped tooth, his name is Brody. He's the worst of them. He enjoyed that basement. Enjoyed every minute of it." Elias's jaw tightened. His hand, resting on the table, curled into a fist. "You should have let them take me," Margaret said again. "You still could. If I walk out that door right now, they might leave you alone. You could go back to your quiet life. Forget any of this happened." She started to rise from her chair. "Sit down." The words came out harder than Elias intended. Margaret froze, half standing, her eyes wide. Elias took a breath and softened his voice. "Sit down, Margaret. Please." She sank back into the chair. Elias ran a hand over his face, feeling the stubble, the tiredness, the weight of everything pressing down. "I'm not letting you walk out into that," he said. "Not with them out there. Not with what you just told me." Then what? Her voice cracked. We sit here until they come? Until they break down that door and finish what they started in Chicago? Because they will, Elias. They won't stop. They never stop. Elias looked around the cabin. At the fire. At the rifle above the door. At the woman across from him, trembling with fear and exhaustion and something that might have been hope, buried so deep she probably didn't recognize it anymore. He thought about his reflection in the window. The man who protected nothing by hiding. The man who called himself safe but was just alone. You said you ran from Boston, he said slowly. From Chicago. From every place they found you. Margaret nodded. Running didn't work. Elias leaned forward. So maybe we try something different. The rain continued to fall. The clock ticked on. Margaret stared at him, and in her eyes, something shifted. That flicker of hope, growing just a little brighter. Then, through the sound of the rain, another sound. Distant but clear. The howl of a wolf. Or maybe not a wolf. Elias had lived in this country long enough to know the difference. That was a signal. A call. From the ridge to the south. He stood and walked to the window, keeping to the side, not showing himself. Through the rain, he couldn't see anything. But he knew. They were out there. Watching. Waiting. And then Elias realized the story Margaret had just told him was only part of the truth. The scar on her wrist, the manacles, the running, all of it real. But there was something she hadn't said. Something she was still holding back. He could see it in the way she wouldn't quite meet his eyes now, in the way her hands had stopped shaking the moment that howl echoed through the rain. The witness to a murder story was true. But Margaret Walsh wasn't just a witness. She was something more. Something she hadn't found the courage to tell him yet. Another howl, closer this time. Elias reached for the rifle. Sometimes the hardest part of running isn't the danger behind you. It's the truth you carry inside, the truth you're afraid to speak out loud because once spoken, it changes everything. Margaret had told Elias part of her story. But the rest of it, the part that explained why Brody and his men would never stop hunting her, was still locked away. And until she let it out, they couldn't begin to face what was coming. The last snow of winter melted into the creek on a warm March morning, the water running fast and clear over smooth stones. March 20th, 1888. 5 months since that night on the ridge. 5 months since everything changed. Elias stood on the porch of the cabin, his hands resting on the worn wooden railing, watching the water rush by. The sun felt warm on his face, the kind of warmth that meant spring had finally arrived in the Wyoming territory. The kind of warmth that made a man believe in new beginnings. Behind him, the chipped blue door stood open. He could hear movement inside, the clatter of a pot, the soft hum of a woman's voice. Ordinary sounds. Domestic sounds. Sounds he'd never imagined hearing in this cabin when he built it with his own hands 15 years ago. He wasn't wearing his gun belt. That was the first thing he noticed most mornings now. The absence of its weight on his hip. The brass buckle that had once been too small hung on a peg by the door, and looped through it now was a coil of rope. Rope for mending fences. Rope for tying back the horses. Rope for the work of building a life, not protecting one. The men from the ridge were gone. Brody and his companions had been taken to the sheriff in Laramie the morning after that night. Margaret's testimony, along with the evidence she'd carried with her from Boston, papers she'd hidden in the lining of her coat, documents proving Cornelius Hayes's crimes, had been enough. Enough to put them away. Enough to finally, after all those years, set her free. Margaret had told Elias the rest of her truth on the long ride to Laramie. The part she'd been holding back. She hadn't just witnessed Hayes kill a man. She'd taken something from his study that night. A ledger. A book filled with names and dates and payments. Evidence of Hayes's corruption reaching all the way to state officials in Massachusetts. It was the reason they'd never stop hunting her. Not just to silence a witness, but to recover what she'd stolen. I should have told you sooner, she'd said, her voice small against the vast Wyoming landscape. I was afraid you'd send me away. Afraid you'd want no part of it. Elias had ridden beside her for a long moment before answering. "I don't want any part of it," he'd said finally. "But I want every part of you. There's a difference." She'd cried then. The first time he'd seen her really cry, not just the silent tears of fear or exhaustion, but real crying, like something inside her had finally let go. He'd stopped the wagon and held her right there on the open road, with nothing but sky and prairie around them, and let her cry until there was nothing left. That was 5 months ago. Now Margaret stepped onto the porch beside him, a cup of coffee in each hand. She wore a simple homespun dress, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Her arms were tan now from working outside, from helping with the cattle and the garden and all the 1,000 tasks that came with ranch life. The scar on her wrist was still there, pale against her skin, but she no longer hid it. No longer pulled her sleeves down when someone might see. She handed him a cup and stood beside him, looking out at the creek. "Chickens are fed," she said. "Cows milked. Gardens ready for planting soon as the ground warms up a few more days. You've been busy." Elias took a sip of the coffee. It was perfect. She'd learn how he liked it, strong and black with just a hint of sugar. The little things. The million little things that added up to a life shared. Someone has to be. She bumped her shoulder against his, just slightly. "You'd stand out here all day watching water if I let you." "Maybe." Elias smiled. It came easier now, smiling. He'd almost forgotten how, before she came. Watching water's peaceful. "It is." Margaret leaned against the railing beside him. "Peaceful is good." They stood like that for a while, not talking, just being together. The creek babbled and rushed. A bird called from the pines. The sun climbed higher, warming the porch, warming them. Ordinary moments. Precious moments. After a while, Margaret went back inside. Elias heard her moving around, sweeping, straightening, the small sounds of someone making a house a home. He finished his coffee and set the cup on the railing, then walked to the edge of the porch and looked toward the corral. 2 horses stood there, dozing in the sun. His old mare and the gelding he'd bought for Margaret last month, a gentle creature with a calm eye and a smooth gait. She'd named him Patch, for the white marking on his forehead. She rode him every chance she got, exploring the land with the wonder of someone who'd spent too many years hiding in cities, afraid to be seen. The land looked different through her eyes. Elias had known every rock and tree for years, but he'd stopped seeing them. Margaret saw everything. The way the light hit the mountains at sunset. The wildflowers that bloomed in hidden meadows. The deer that came to drink at dawn. She pointed these things out, and Elias found himself seeing them again too. Behind him, Margaret came back out with a basket of laundry. She walked to the clothesline strung between 2 pine trees and began hanging shirts and sheets, pegging them carefully so the wind wouldn't blow them away. Elias watched her work. Watched the way she moved, efficient and graceful. Watched the way the sun caught her hair, bringing out hints of red he hadn't noticed before. Watched the scar on her wrist as she reached up to hang a shirt, pale against her skin but no longer a secret, no longer a source of shame. She caught him looking and smiled. A real smile, the kind that reached her eyes. "You're staring, Elias Vance." "Maybe I am." "Find something interesting." "Maybe I did." She laughed, a sound that had become more common over the months. A sound that filled the cabin and the yard and Elias's heart in ways he couldn't put into words. She went back to hanging laundry, and he went back to watching, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with talk. The morning passed. Elias mended a section of fence near the corral. Margaret finished the laundry and started bread, the smell of yeast and warmth drifting out the open door. Around noon, they ate together at the small table, bread and cheese and leftover stew, their knees almost touching beneath the wood. "Sheriff Thompson rode by yesterday while you were at the creek," Margaret said. "Said Hayes's trial is set for June. They've got enough evidence to put him away for life, maybe more. Said we probably won't need to testify after all." "That's good news." "It is." She tore off a piece of bread. "Means I'm really free. Not just hiding, But free. Officially. Elias reached across the table and took her hand. The one with the scar. His thumb traced the pale line, feeling the slightly raised texture of healed skin. "You've been free since the moment you got off that stage," he said. "The rest is just paperwork." Margaret's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She smiled instead, that real smile, and squeezed his hand. After lunch, Elias walked to the peg by the door. His gun belt hung there, the brass buckle glinting in the afternoon light. He hadn't worn it in months. Hadn't needed to. The rifle was still above the door, cleaned and ready if trouble ever came again. But the gun belt, his father's gun belt, had found a new purpose. He lifted it down and ran his fingers over the worn leather. Then he took the coil of rope from where it hung on the peg and threaded it through the buckle, the same way he'd seen it done 100 times in his mind before finally doing it for real. The rope settled into place, held by the same brass that had once held his father's pistol, that had held his own through years of guarding and protecting. A tool for building now, not for fighting. He hung it back on the peg and stepped outside. Margaret was in the yard, gathering the dry laundry from the line. The sheets billowed in the breeze, white against the blue sky, and she moved among them like a dancer, collecting each piece with practiced ease. Elias walked toward her. The sun was warm. The creek rushed. The mountains stood guard in the distance, same as they always had. Margaret saw him coming and paused, a sheet half-folded in her hands. "Everything okay?" "Everything's perfect." Elias stopped beside her. "I was thinking, we should plant that garden this week. Get the seeds in before the ground dries out too much." "Thought you'd never ask." She finished folding the sheet and added it to the basket. "I saw a spot south of the corral that would be perfect. Good sun, close to the creek for water. Then that's where we'll plant." They stood together in the yard, surrounded by laundry and sunshine and the promise of spring. Margaret's hand found his, their fingers intertwining naturally, like they'd been doing it for years instead of months. "Elias." Her voice was soft. "Yeah. Thank you. For that day at the depot. For not looking away." Elias squeezed her hand. "Thank you for getting off that stage." She laughed again, that beautiful sound. Then she picked up the laundry basket and headed toward the cabin. At the door, she paused and looked back. "Coffee's hot," she said. "You coming?" Elias looked around the yard one more time. At the corral with the horses dozing. At the creek rushing with snow melt. At the mountains standing eternal on the horizon. At the cabin with its chipped blue door standing open, warm light spilling out, a woman waiting inside. He thought about the man he'd been a year ago, alone in the same yard, checking his gun belt, preparing for threats, surviving but not living. That man felt like a stranger now. A ghost. Someone he used to know. The brass buckle on his father's gun belt caught the light one last time, glinting from its place on the peg. Not a warning anymore. Not a weight to carry. Just a reminder of where he'd been and how far he'd come. Elias walked toward the open door. Toward the warmth. Toward the woman who had changed everything by arriving with nothing but a lie and a scar and a courage she didn't know she had. "Coming," he said. And he stepped inside. Sometimes the life we think we want isn't the life we need at all. Sometimes the greatest gift arrives in the most unexpected package, wrapped in trouble and fear and a past that won't let go. And sometimes, if we are brave enough to open that door instead of walking away, we find not just someone worth protecting, but someone who makes us want to become the person we always could have been. The creek rushed on. The mountains stood guard. And in a small cabin in the Wyoming territory, two people who'd started as strangers sat down together at a wooden table, ready to face whatever came next. Not alone. Never alone again.